I am Julie Murphy. I'm the manager of the evening lecture series here at the Mariners Museum and Park. It's my pleasure to find fascinating people like Dr. Newby-Alexander to come and spend the evening with us tonight. The evening lecture series is funded in part by the Ann and Tom Honeycutt Fund, and we do wish to acknowledge that funding that helps us bring you the quality, well-known, passionate people like we're getting ready to hear from. When my colleagues and I began planning the February programming for Black History Month, I could think of no one better that I wanted to be with us than Cassandra Newby-Alexander. I've been following her for years with many of her works. She is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Professor of History, and Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University. Among her book publications are An African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, and her latest book, which I know she's probably working on at least one more or two, but her latest we will hear about tonight, Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad. This is yet another way that we are exploring how we are connected by the waterways, and certainly Virginia's waterways in particular tonight. We have seen her on BBC, C-SPAN, the History Channel, Talk of the Nation, WHRO, everywhere. She's been a consultant for museums all over Virginia and beyond, and she was the co-chair of the Virginia Commission on African American History Education in the Commonwealth that was established by Governor Ralph Northam. She serves on numerous boards. I don't know how she has time to do what she does, but she is on the board of the Virginia Law Foundation and WHRO, our favorite PBS affiliate. Numerous awards and commendations have been awarded her. I was most impressed that she was granted the award for the Humanitarian Award from the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, a fabulous organization that I follow personally their work. It is my pleasure to turn this program over now to Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Thank you so much, Julie. What a gracious introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to really talk about what I consider to be my favorite subject, which is the Underground Railroad. And I'm going to get my um, PowerPoint started. Um, I want to really share some things that I talked about in my book on Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad. And just to tell you, this book was designed to just get my feet wet in the subject. I was limited to a certain number of pages. I convinced the publisher to let me say a little bit more, and yet and still I had to cut about 10,000 words from my work. So I am working on my longer discussion that is going to get into some of the communities, the free Black communities in Pennsylvania, especially in and around Philadelphia and going down to Chester County, and talking about the Black communities in Philadelphia, near Germantown, and then going in and talking about the communities in Boston and in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then finally getting a little bit more detaily about the communities that emerged in Canada. All of that is really to tell you that the story is complex, is rich, and it has not finished. In fact, I'm going to introduce tonight some information. If you've been looking at the newspapers and you've heard a little bit about the archaeological dig that transpired at St. Mary's Basilica in Norfolk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tunnel and some things that we found out, some little juicy tidbits. I want to start off with talking about a man named Isaac Foreman. He and William Davis and Willis Reddick all escaped in December of 1853 on the steamship, the City of Richmond, and it was in the Norfolk port. And they escaped, and the steamship went up to the city of Philadelphia. And this was written by William Still, who was the station master on the Underground Railroad and a free black. He said that all these passengers arrived together concealed per steamship City of Richmond, December 1853. Isaac Foreman, the youngest of the party, 23 years of age and a dark mulatto, would be considered by a Southerner capable of judging as very likely. He fled from a widow by the name of Mrs. Saunders. He stated that he had a wife living in Richmond and that she was confined the morning he took the Underground Railroad. Of course, he could not see her. The privilege of living in Richmond with his wife had been denied him. Thus, fearing to render her unhappy, he was obliged to conceal from her his intention to escape. Now, the other two men, William Davis and Willis Reddick, also fled, and they fled because they feared that their owners were going to sell them. Unfortunately, they left their wives and children behind. Well, in one case, left his wife behind, just like Isaac Foreman. And the other situation, he left his wife and daughter. He tried to get them out, but couldn't. And so William Davis, let me talk a little bit about him. He was originally from Portsmouth. And his owner, Joseph Reynolds, who was a merchant, had threatened numerous times to sell him. And he was actually sick and tired of that. And that's kind of what prompted him to flee. But he also fled because he feared that his owner would actually make good on his threat. And he ended up leaving his wife Catherine and his daughter Louisa and an infant son. He tried very hard to get them out, but was unsuccessful, and he left aboard the ship. Reddick, Willis Reddick, left, and he said that he didn't want to actually have children. And that was partly what motivated him to leave. He said that, quote, slavery existed expressly for the purpose of crushing souls and breaking tender hearts. And then, of course, we had Isaac Foreman. Isaac Foreman was working as a steward aboard the steamship, the Augusta, that went back and forth between Norfolk, Richmond, and of course, Philadelphia. But interestingly, he secured his own passage using the assistance of another steward who was a free black man by the name of John Minkins to help all three of them escape aboard the City of Richmond. And all of the steamships pretty much looked alike. And this compartment that many of them found themselves hidden in was right by the boiler. So if you can imagine 2 to 3 days aboard a ship in the summer next to the boiler room, that was a horrific situation that many of them endured. And for Isaac Foreman, he decided not to tell his wife. He feared that she would convince him to stay, and he was not going to stay. He feared also that if he had children, that he would not be able to control the fate of his children, that they would be sold from him, and that was something that he simply could not tolerate. So the three men left, and we know that they passed through the station in Philadelphia. We know that for a few days they stayed at the home of one of the free blacks, and eventually all three of them ended up in Toronto. Now, I couldn't find any information about what happened to the other two, but I do know that Isaac Foreman worked at this hotel. It was the hotel in Toronto. And soon after he arrived, he actually had a lot of correspondence with William Still. So, what is interesting about William Still? We love him as historians. We love him because he was a serious pack rat. He never threw a single piece of paper away, and as a result, we were able to get all of the newspapers of the provincial freemen, which was actually published in Toronto, and it was published by a Black woman. We were able to find all of his accounts of the people who passed through his station starting in about 1851. And the reason he started taking these accounts in 1851 was because he encountered a man who was older than him, and he found out that this man was from the same place from which his parents escaped. And then he found out that the young man was his older brother who had been sold away from the family. They were all enslaved, although William Still was born in he was born in the North, although technically he would be considered an enslaved man, but he lived openly as a free Black. And so William Still's accounts start from 1851 and they go until 1860. And no other station master on the Underground Railroad not only took copious notes of the people who passed through their stations, but kept them. In fact, during the Civil War, he buried all of his records in a cemetery because he was afraid that the Confederacy would actually push through the federal lines and get into the city of Philadelphia and recover his notes, and thereby being able to secure the location of each of those individuals who escaped from slavery. So he did not want that to happen, and he placed all of the records in a cemetery. And then afterwards, he published selected letters and accounts in his book that was it was over 700 pages long. And so he created this incredible archive for historians to follow. And in the case of Isaac Foreman, I found out some interesting information. And I want to just read you a few selections that I've written about him. And it's in an article that's part of a book coming out next year on the waterways and the connection between Norfolk and New Bedford, Massachusetts. According to the records, after he secured a job at the Russell Hotel, he fell into a deep, deep depression. His wife, Fanny, was the love of his life. He wrote to William Still that he was, quote, very gloomy in his heart. It was almost breaking to think about his wife. In his second letter, he said, quote, my soul is vexed. My troubles are inexpressible. I often feel as if I were willing to die. I must see my wife. In short, if not, I will die. What would I not give no tongue can utter? Just to gaze on her sweet lips one moment, I would be willing to die the next. I am determined to see her sometime or the other. Amazingly, he was able, in working with William Still, to secure passage for his wife Fanny, who apparently had to delay meeting him because she was pregnant. Now, it's not known that what happened to their first child. In fact, the records show that she had a child, and then it shows that another child was there and the first child was not. So apparently the first child died. But he worked with some other individuals who had been conductors on the Underground Railroad, like John Hill, who was from Petersburg, who kept a lot of letters writing back and forth, talking to William Still about the progress of some of the other freedom seekers who were living in the Ontario province that he was communicating with. And so we know that Foreman reunited with his wife and that they lived in a town called Brantford. And so here's a letter written by William Still. Now, what is interesting, excuse me, by James Foreman. Now, what's interesting about this is Isaac Foreman and James Foreman were brothers, and both of them escaped. And so James Foreman would write and Isaac Foreman would write, which tells us that there were at least some rudimentary skills that they both shared of how to read and write. And it also then tells us why in the city of Norfolk, there was tremendous concern from slaveholders, and you would see this not only in the ordinances that were passed, but also in the letters to the editor, the newspaper accounts and so forth, that they believed that many people were getting secretly taught, that they were communicating with abolitionists. In fact, we know that in the 1840s, Norfolk passed an ordinance to demand that the postmaster stop delivering abolitionist newspapers to their enslaved population. Of course, that kind of blew my mind to think that the postmaster was actually delivering abolitionist newspapers to enslaved people, which then tells me that the world that I imagine in the past was very different than what actually existed. And so Foreman did reunite with his wife. He lived in Brantford, Canada, and lived to a ripe old age and died on September 4th, 1897. Now, I'm saying the ripe old age, I'm close to this ripe old age of 65. And of course, at that time, 65 was really considered the ripe old age. His brother escaped 2 years after he did. But unlike Isaac, James was not married, but he did have a fiance. Her name was Mariah Moore. And he managed to get her also on a ship to join him because he had joined his brother up in Canada. But unlike his brother, who was in Toronto, he was in the Niagara region on the Canadian side of Niagara. And what's so interesting about this letter is it gives us some incredible details about the meeting. So after he was able to secure passage for his fiance, he was unsuccessful in getting his parents and his sisters out. But once he got his fiance, he got word to her to meet him on the suspension bridge. So I see a film moment here where the two of them were to meet in the middle of the suspension bridge, and she was to let him know by telegraph when she had arrived on the American side of Niagara Falls, and she was to stay at the International Hotel and then meet him on the suspension bridge. And this is a drawing of that suspension bridge. And so you can kind of visualize this incredible meeting of the two people. After a few weeks, the two were married and they lived the rest of their lives in Canada. And so I've spoken a bit about what motivated these three men to leave, but let's just talk a little bit about everybody else. What were some general motivations? Well, we know that family was tremendously important to not only free people, but enslaved people as well. And it was particularly heartbreaking for enslaved people to know they had no control, no say, no voice in what would happen to their spouse, to their mother, their father, to their children, to their siblings. They had no say. And if they spoke up, they risked others being sold. They risked punishment, sometimes not punishment on them, but punishment on their loved ones. The picture that I have here is of a slave market in Richmond. In fact, both Richmond and Norfolk had slave traders whose offices were located on Main Street. In Norfolk, on Main Street, it was close to where City Hall is today. The slave market was actually where the Confederate monument used to be. It was located about 5 feet from that monument. Um, you can imagine then that the slave market was a horrendous place. This was a place of separation. This was a place of pain. And this was a place where people who were separated thought that they would never see their loved one again. In fact, most enslaved people, when they were sold from one another, saw that selling as death. And some continued on and married other people, while many died without ever remarrying or ever seeing their loved ones again. And so the separation was a real big motivating issue. And many men who left thought that if they left, they would be in a position to perhaps help secure the freedom of their loved ones if they were in a northern area. And that was the motivation. And we read it in their accounts time and time again that they asked William Still and other abolitionists to help them secure their family's freedom. We know that harsh treatment was often a motivator for leaving. Some people were actually involved in the Underground Railroad. In fact, the majority of the conductors on the Underground Railroad, if they were enslaved, but some free blacks as well, really had to leave the area. If they didn't, they would have either been sold away themselves or they would have been imprisoned. In fact, if you look at the penitentiary records in Virginia in the 1850s and 1860s, you will see a listing of people who were there. Their sentence was usually a death sentence. It was 10 years in the penitentiary, and no one survived 10 years in the penitentiary. And those individuals were condemned to be in the penitentiary because they helped enslaved people escape. Some people wanted to escape because they desired freedom, and that was the key motivator for them. And finally, if your owner died, chances were good that you would be sold away. And so many people, you would see a flurry of escapes, usually around December and January, because those were the big auction days of the year, both in Norfolk and in Portsmouth. And so when you're looking at these accounts, you see a correlation between when people left and what time of year it was. And it was because that was the big auction day. Now, the waterways. In Hampton Roads, water is everywhere. You cannot drive down a road for more than a couple of miles without crossing over some sort of bridge. And you certainly can't go too far in Hampton Roads without going through a tunnel. And in Norfolk, they decided to do something really, really fantastic. They put a tunnel and a drawbridge right up against each other. Of course, I'm being very facetious in talking about that. But water is the lifeblood of Virginia. The waterways were the roadways, and everyone saw their world through the lens of the waterways. It really wasn't until the 1950s and 60s when bridges and tunnels were built that people traveled less by water and more by road. And so our perspective today is very different. than it was even 80 years ago, 60 years ago. And so the waterways, if you look, for example, at the Chesapeake Bay, and you go to the northern neck, chances are good that you will not be able to see the other side because the waterway is vast and it looks like an ocean as opposed to the bay. For the rivers, you can see across the rivers. However, you could not throw a stone across the rivers because it's a vast distance as well. And people of African descent who were brought here by force came from areas in West Central and West Africa in which the landscape very much resembled Hampton Roads. Many were already mariners. They understood the waterways. They were very familiar with the construction of flatboats, and they engaged in flatboat trading and had skiffs and so forth. And so they were instrumental in helping to develop the maritime industry. But that also created problems for Virginia slaveholders because these individuals knew the waterways better than even many whites. In fact, the ferries that went back and forth between Hampton and Norfolk and between Norfolk and Portsmouth and other places typically were manned almost exclusively by African American men. And so this created some tension between the business owners and the authorities because they knew that this created a security vulnerability. But the waterways opened the door for people to escape, but it also opened the doors for people to go to a harsher form of slavery. Norfolk, ironically, was not only the primary departure point for the domestic slave trade, taking people to the Charleston and the New Orleans harbors, but it was also considered the southern depot of the Underground Railroad, taking more people up to points north than any other place in the South. So Norfolk was very key to this shift. Now we know, and I want to give you just a little bit of background. I'm going to just be a minute on this to tell you that what was propelling a lot of owners to sell their slaves to the South was cotton production. In fact, many enslaved people who were the prime of their age and males or prime of their age as a woman producing lots of children could be worth their weight in gold, so to speak. And so Virginia very quickly by the mid 19th century turned its attention a little bit away from tobacco production and more towards human trafficking. There were the primary industry in Virginia was slave trading and slave selling. And the majority of people who were sold to the lower South, going to Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, all the way to East Texas, came from Virginia. And so this helped to spur a lot of runaways. In the 18th century, most of the people who escaped did not try to escape to the north. Instead, they simply tried to escape from wherever they were to a city and disappear as part of the cosmopolitan world of the city. And so there are numerous accounts of people escaping to Norfolk, to Portsmouth, to Williamsburg, and even to the town of Hampton, hoping to disappear among the people. They tried to escape to Richmond doing the same thing. Some were discovered and some were not. But by the time we got into the 19th century, things would change and people knew they had to leave the South entirely and go to northern states because these northern states began passing either immediate or gradual emancipation laws. And of course, places like Massachusetts were important because of the growth of the free Black community and their sense that their lot in life was tied in to the existence of slavery. So they were very much against the continuation of slavery. Now, if you look at the census records, you see where the concentrations are. So here you have the Hampton Roads region, anywhere along the seaboard in Virginia. Those were areas in which enslaved people were concentrated. And then, of course, as you go further south into North Carolina, South Carolina, and of course parts of Georgia, the northern parts of Georgia, you see those numbers increasing. In Virginia, you see also the concentrations. And of course, the areas like Caroline County, Essex, Amelia, those areas really are where tobacco was king. That was the high level of tobacco production. But in the other areas like Norfolk and Southampton County and so forth, most of the enslaved people were involved in the maritime industry in some form or fashion. Some were helping to load ships with goods. Some were involved in the oystering industry. Some were involved in the flatboat trading industries. And some were involved in domestic service. In fact, if you owned a tavern or a hotel, chances were very high that the majority of people who worked in that hotel were enslaved people, whether they were owned by you or they were rented out to you, and you worked them at your hotel. So you can see from this map where the concentrations are. And in each of those areas, you see concentrations of people escaping. By 1830, as you can see, the populations starting to shift to the west, going into or getting close to Texas. But at the same time, the concentrations of African Americans who were enslaved is still very, very high in the same area along the coastal area of Virginia. And of course, by 1860, the population swings into Texas. But look again, the population of people of African descent along the eastern seaboard in Virginia is still very, very high. And so that tells you that throughout this entire period, that this area in Virginia was key, not only for the domestic slave trade, but for the Underground Railroad. We are also seeing what is driving this movement westward to the lower South, and that, of course, is cotton production. In fact, by 1860, cotton production, all of the products produced by enslaved people, as well as the industry of buying and selling of people, if you add up their value, it was more than the value of all of America's industries combined. In fact, by 1860, America produced 7/8 of the world's cotton production. 7/8. And so people escaping from slavery was also big business, or it endangered big business. Sorry, I'm too quick with my fingers. And so part of the big business was the hiring of enslaved people, the rewards system. In fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin had a main villain, aside from Simon Legree, who owned Uncle Tom. The other villain was a constable who was a slave catcher. Lo and behold, she based that character on a constable, John Capehart, from Norfolk, Virginia, who seemingly spent a whole lot of his time in Boston, Massachusetts, capturing enslaved people. And one of those people he captured was a man by the name of George Latimer. He and his wife Rebecca escaped from Norfolk in 1842 because after they got married and she got pregnant, she said, "I'm not having a child born in slavery." And so they left. But he got spotted by Capehart as he was working in a tavern in Boston. Fortunately for them, there were abolitionists that helped to free him. And eventually, they went on to have three other children. And the last child that they had was a man by the name of Lewis Latimer, who became the famous inventor and draftsman who worked for all of the major inventors in the latter part of the 19th, early 20th centuries. In fact, he was the one who invented the filament for Thomas Edison's incandescent light bulb. Well, we know that in 1850, there were a whole bunch of different fugitive slave acts. In fact, we had the Fugitive Slave Clause that was part of the Constitution that indicated that if you were that the federal government would be the one to protect the institution of slavery, which was very, very interesting because according to the Constitution, personal property, um, whether it was what you owned or your home or your land, real estate, that was controlled by the states. But there was only one personal property that the federal government guaranteed they would protect, and that was slaves. And that was part of the Fugitive Slave Clause. And every so many years, the federal government would strengthen the power of slaveholders to retrieve their slaves because they were aware of the value that enslaved people provided to Americans in that particular time period, especially in what we call the antebellum period from 1800 to 1860. And so slave hunting was big business. There was also a kidnapping ring that was very big business in the 1830s and 40s. For those of you who may have seen the film or read the book 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup was from New York, who was lured to Washington, D.C., drugged, found himself without his free papers, without his clothing, because by then, slaveholders made sure that people could identify their slaves by them wearing a certain type of clothing made from a certain type of rough cotton cloth. And so he woke up in a jail. He was beaten to a pulp, put on the train, and he went from Washington, D.C. to Richmond. And then from Richmond, he was put on a ship and taken down to the Norfolk Harbor. And another free black who had been captured by slave kidnappers, beaten, and dragged onto the ship was also taken in the dead of night aboard that ship. Well, this slave catching ring was really a conspiracy that involved people from Washington, D.C., Richmond. Norfolk was the center of the slave catching ring. And then, of course, or the slave kidnapping, no, the kidnapping ring. And of course, people in New Orleans. And it was very, very, very big business. And this is what propelled, as I said, a lot of free blacks, especially in the North, to begin to advocate for an end, a national end to slavery. And so the reaction to this 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that now allow bounty hunters to not only easily retrieve people accused of being a slave, but enslaved, those accused of being a fugitive slave could not even testify on their own behalf in court. In addition to that, there was a special court set up where the magistrate was paid $5 if he found that this individual was not a runaway, and $10 if he found that the person was a runaway, presumably because there was more paperwork. But of course, abolitionists said that incentivized magistrates to declare people fugitive slaves. So there was a real concerted effort to help get people out of America altogether, or to hide them deeply within communities of color that could also be protected by white communities. And we would see this especially in New Bedford, but we would see this in Chester County, in Pennsylvania, and in areas just outside the city of Philadelphia. We know that there were regular trips being made by steamships. And in fact, I wanted to just show you the steamer Augusta, that it was leaving this place called Wright's Wharf, which is right near the uh, baseball stadium in Norfolk. It left on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And so we know from these documents where people were leaving, who was controlling the ship, and of course, who was actually, who were some of the people on board. And this is another picture of one of the steamships, the Philadelphia, that left Norfolk on a regular basis. Sorry, my fingers hit it too fast again. So I wanted to just show you a few places in the Norfolk Harbor, because people often would make their way, even if they escaped from Hampton or Warwick County, which is now Newport News, or even Williamsburg, they would actually get aboard steamships to take them, of course, to points north. We know where some of these main places are. So if you look at Higgins Wharf, that area is where the baseball stadium is located today. We know that the Norfolk ferry dock brought people from the Portsmouth side over to the Norfolk side. And many people who were coming up through the Dismal Swamp and made their way to Portsmouth would try to get to the Norfolk Harbor and, of course, get over to Norfolk so that they could leave on one of the schooners or steamers that were leaving. If you go to Waterside in Norfolk, you'll see a plaque where there's a picture of a scene where a captain is chopping away at one of the ships. And that event actually happened on that particular site. That's where all of the schooners were located. And we know that some of the captains actually created secret compartments aboard their ships, the schooners, and they were able to secret larger numbers of people, not the smaller numbers aboard the steamships, but larger numbers, anywhere from 5 to upwards of 25 people leaving. And that's when you would see more family groups leaving as opposed to individuals leaving to go to the north or even to Canada. I want to tell you a story about a group of people that I found some information about, and it was just by chance. There was a story that William Still told about a woman by the name of Clarissa Davis, who adopted an alias, Mary Armstead. Clarissa Davis, William and Charles Davis, brothers and sister, were supposed to get aboard the Ellen Barnes, but for whatever reason, Clarissa could not make it to their rendezvous point, and the ship left. And it took William and Charles through Philadelphia, and eventually they ended up settling in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And she tried for 75 days, hiding out, praying, hoping that she would be able to get aboard a ship and meet her family in New Bedford. She was helped eventually by two conductors. One, John Minkins, who was a free Black man who worked aboard the City of Richmond, and a white conductor on the Underground Railroad who actually had a prominent position in the city. He was the cashier at the Virginia National Bank. His name was William Bagnall. And she made it to the ship. They dressed her as a man, and she made it to the ship, and of course, secured passage from Philadelphia eventually to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And their father also would later join them. They were all members of the Colored Methodist Church in Portsmouth. We see their names in the records. In fact, the picture of Reverend George Bain, he was the pastor of that church because after the Nat Turner Revolt, um, you could not have Black ministers in the South. You could not have Black ministers of Black churches. Usually it was a white person. And often these individuals were very sympathetic to the plight of their congregational members. And this man actually kept some accounts of the people who were leaving from his church and actually seemingly supported their departure. Another man who was a member of that church was Robert Irvin, who changed his name to Sheridan Ford. He was born in 1827. I found out some information, which I'll tell you in a minute how I found it out, about his sister, who his sister was, his brother-in-law. In fact, his brother-in-law was a free Black who worked at the Gosport Navy Shipyard in Portsmouth, which is now called the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth. And he purchased the freedom of his wife, and the two of them would actually leave and settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts. We know that Robert's, his mother's master, where she lived, and we know from the account that he actually worked with his father at the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth. They worked as construction laborers. Well, it was in 1845 that Robert would marry a woman by the name of Julia. And she was considered the favorite slave of John Hodges, who got the title of General John Hodges because of his work during the Mexican War. What was interesting is the account said that John Hodges actually married them with the common book inside of his house, and allowed Robert and Julia to actually stay at the house, live together, and that's where they had 3 children. We know that that Sheridan Ford, I'll start calling him Sheridan, had friends, Charles Bracy and David Johnson, who apparently, according to his account, helped him to escape. And this is the place where they lived, in the bottom basement part. Of course, now the family has actually put a flooring in the house, but when Sheridan Ford and his wife lived in that house, it was a damp earthen floor. Well, Sheridan Ford ended up going to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And before he went, as I said, he and his wife had 3 children, Robert Jr., George, and Frank. But Frank was the only son who remained in Portsmouth. And we would know the story of Sheridan Ford because of Frank. Now, Sheridan Ford wrote some desperate letters to William Still, pleaded with him to help him find his family, because apparently after he had to escape because his owner was about to sell him, and he hung around for a couple of months trying to get his family out, his wife's owner, John Hodges, put them in the slave jail in Norfolk, so he couldn't get to them. Eventually he left and then was desperate trying to get them and to secure their freedom. But the yellow fever epidemic happened in the summer of 1855. And he didn't know what happened to them, and neither did his friends. As it turned out, John Hodges died, and the family sold Julia and the 3 children to a relative in Goldsboro, North Carolina. So after so many years of trying to find them in 1863, Sheridan Ford gave up and he married Clarissa Davis, who was now Mary Armstead. And the two of them had two children, Leonard and Margaret. It seems that Sheridan Ford still loved his first wife because in 1865, his friends wrote him to tell him that his wife had returned to Portsmouth. But because she thought she would never see him again, she also remarried. But he visited his family. He visited his sons twice, came back to Portsmouth. But he visited one last time in 1895, and he gave Frank a gold watch and told him, when I die, you will be one of the inheritors to my properties. Because he owned two houses. He had $1,200 in the bank in 1895. So he had done quite well for himself. After he told his son that he would be an inheritor, he said, son, I can't come here anymore. It's too painful. When I see that I can no longer reunite as a family, I can't come here anymore. And then he turned to his first wife, Julia, and he said, had I not been forced to leave this year, we would have celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. He returned back to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and that's where he died. Unfortunately for Frank, and his two brothers actually had moved up to New York and they passed away from one of the plagues up in New York at that time. His two half siblings, Leonard and Margaret, refused to share their estate after their mother, Mary, died. And so Frank filed a lawsuit. And the lawsuit actually established a precedence case because the court in Massachusetts ruled that because they did not recognize the legality of slavery, slave marriages were not legal. And so therefore, Frank was not a legal heir and therefore had no standing. Virginia, however, changed its laws saying that all slave marriages were legal, and thereby, if you filed a case in Virginia, he would have actually won his case. Fortunately for us, as historians, the records of the court case tell us the story because depositions were taken from Frank and from his mother and from the friends who helped Sheridan Ford escape and from several other individuals telling this important story. And this story would lead eventually to reconnecting with the descendants of Frank who knew nothing about this history because the pain of those experiences were not passed down. And the family came to visit, and they stayed with the family who now owns John Hodges's home. In fact, that family actually researched and contacted the descendants of Frank, and they actually visited and stayed in the home, and they visited the church that their ancestors were members of, what became Emmanuel AME Church. And this is a picture of one of them in Emmanuel Church. And so I just wanted to show you some of the locations of these places that were so important. And as you can see, Portsmouth was only 2 square miles. Norfolk at this time was only 4 square miles. So you're not talking about a huge distance. And when the church, the original site on Glasgow Street, when that church was burned, they moved the church to North Street. And so the Sheridan Ford and his family actually had attended the Glasgow Street Church. Now, we also know from other sources that Emmanuel AME Church, as it would be known, was very much involved with the Underground Railroad. In fact, Mrs. Jane Pyatt gave an interview with the Writers Project in the 1930s about just that. And she talked about how Emmanuel actually had a cellar that was used to help people hide in until they could get aboard ships leaving from the Elizabeth River. And I want to show you this picture of what the India Wharf looked like. And actually it was very close to Higgins Wharf. And this is where a lot of the steamships, they would leave from that area. And so my supposition is that when Clarissa Davis was hiding out in a miserable coop, it was probably somewhere around these wharves. I also wanted to just let you know that William Still, this is a picture of William Still, he recorded over 763 accounts of freedom seekers who left from Maryland and Virginia and Delaware and other places. And you can see that from Virginia, there were 285 accounts. The 350 that came from Maryland were higher simply because they were closer to Philadelphia. This does not include all the accounts of people who went directly to New Bedford or to Boston. But in those accounts, it gives us some interesting information. And as you can see, the numbers of people who escaped from Norfolk, this just gives you a glimpse of how many people actually escaped, because it was a fraction of the numbers. And to really help us to understand, I worked with the City of Norfolk to create this map to just show you a few of the people who escaped and the stories of their escape. And so if you're interested, you can contact either the Visitors Bureau in Norfolk or go to their website, and I believe they actually have the map that you can download. One other thing I want to tell you, and that is that William Still included a lot of great pictures, images that he drew. And this one was particularly interesting because it shows you a skiff in the Hampton Roads. And you all know that the Hampton Roads is that body of water between Norfolk and Hampton. It is a very it's a deep water area, and the waters are usually rough. And you have to be pretty brave to get in a tiny little boat and traverse the Hampton Roads. And that really shows you how desperate people were. And these individuals who escaped actually escaped successfully. In fact, Jeffrey Wilson's brother, Robert Emerson, would end up going to Canada. And then eventually moving after the Civil War, he would move to California, to the San Francisco area, and he worked at the newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst. And so his story is one that is quite interesting as well. Now, I told you there was a picture of a captain tearing away at his ship, and that man was Alfred Fountain, who was quite a bombastic captain. He actually had 22 individuals hidden aboard his ship, and he successfully got them out of Norfolk and took them to freedom. And those individuals ended up getting distributed to a wide variety of areas, both in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, as well as Canada. We would also see a number of people passing through the Dismal Swamp. And I just mentioned that a little bit, and I want to just mention it again. The Dismal Swamp had two basic groups of people. You had those who were maroons. Those were people who actually lived in the swamp, had children, lived and died in the swamp. And then you had people who were on the fringes of the swamp, who were passing through to get to the Norfolk Harbor. And so we see a few accounts of individuals who were seen in and around the swamp, or who were reported to actually traverse through the swamp on their way to the Norfolk Harbor. And so slave catchers were everywhere trying to find these individuals. But some of the people actually decided, rather than trying to escape to points north, that they would make their home among the maroons in the Dismal Swamp, which you have to be pretty hardy to make your way into the Dismal Swamp and stay there. What is amazing is the work of Dan Sayers, an archaeologist who's actually discovered over 20 maroon communities of people. So he has actually found the remains of 20, at least 20 different maroon communities throughout the swamp. And so we know that there were people who lived essentially among us as fugitive slaves. Some of the places in Philadelphia that really helped with the Underground Railroad. You see this picture of where the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia met, and these were the ones. The Vigilance Committee is what William Still was in charge of, and they met at the African Zoar Methodist Church, where they planned their activities. But I also wanted you to see exactly where New Bedford was, especially in relation to Boston. And it was in New Bedford, and here's a picture from the harbor of New Bedford. It was a big whaling city. This is where the majority of enslaved people, these freedom seekers, settled. And I don't know if you know, but this is why Frederick Douglass decided to actually recruit soldiers for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, because he knew that the people who had escaped, or the children of those who had escaped, would perhaps make the bravest, most determined soldiers for this new unit. And so we see in New Bedford a community of both whites and blacks that seemed very hostile to slaves, excuse me, not to slaves, but to slave owners and to slave trading. And it seemed that that community, they were at least accused by slaveholders of protecting enslaved people. And that's why that area was so important. But you know, the waterways were not only important along the eastern seaboard, but as you go further inland, we would see canals, and of course the James River would continue almost all the way to Ohio, and the waterways continued to be utilized to help people escape. And here's a picture of freedom seekers and how even on those waterways, such as going across the Ohio River, or going into Pennsylvania, you would see the use of waterways and smaller ships in helping people to find freedom. And finally, we would see where some of those individuals would settle in the Ontario province. And some of the individuals would live the rest of their lives in Ontario, while others at the end of the Civil War would either return home, like John Hill, he returned back to Petersburg. Others, of course, would return back to the United States, but not necessarily to their homes in the South. And I promised I would tell you one last thing, and that is currently there's a lot of research happening at St. Mary's Basilica in Norfolk. As they were doing renovation of their church, at the front of the church, they uncovered a tunnel. This tunnel is 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and it is part of a two-part tunnel, both of which would lead to the water. This tunnel was not part of any waterworks. It's not on any city map. There's no reference to it. And so this was something that was actually constructed, and it was constructed to preserve, because of course it was so close to the water that this brick line tunnel would survive. And what's interesting is that when St. Mary's was built, there was a St. Patrick's Church built. It was just a few feet from where St. Mary's would be built. St. Patrick's had been burned down reportedly because of their involvement with abolitionism. They made sure that the architecture of the church would be altered so that this tunnel would not be destroyed. And around the tunnel are 14 graves. Now, we don't know yet about those 14 graves, but we do know a little bit about the story of Mary Ogilvie, who later married a man named Leveste, and she became known as Mary Leveste. And she was a member of St. Patrick's Catholic Church. This is a church established for the Haitian refugees, primarily the white Haitian refugees who would come to Virginia. But her father was a Haitian refugee. Her mother was a free Black in Virginia. And of course, the two got married and had Mary. This church was filled with people from Haiti that was known as Santo Domingo. What's interesting is that in 1840, she purchased a young boy who was from Haiti, Marc Rene de Morty, for $350. And it appears as if she kept him as a slave until he was almost 21. Now, you may say, oh, that's a horrible thing. Well, Virginia, around the turn of the 19th century, passed a law saying if you were recently freed, you had 1 year to get out of the state. And if you did not, you would be re-enslaved. And so it appears that holding him as a slave protected him for quite a long time. This is a picture of Marc Rene de Morty. When he was 18 years old, he got involved with the Underground Railroad, helping countless people escape. It looks like it might have been in the hundreds. In fact, he worked with a man by the name of Dr. Harry Lundy. Of course, he probably wasn't a real doctor, who was a free Black who had a business. He would, in exchange for some money, arrange for enslaved people to escape. And he had a very robust correspondence listing of people who were abolitionists in the North. So he would connect them with ship's captains and would make sure that they made it safely to the North. And De Morty became a part of that. And we know some of the people that he actually helped escape. And it seems that because he was a member of that church, that there's a direct correlation between his activities and what was happening on the grounds of that church and that tunnel that was in the middle of the sanctuary. Now, Mary Ogilvie her husband actually was a free Black, and he worked in the engineers department. And it seems that he was the one who copied the plans that the Confederates were making for their ironclad conversion of the USS Merrimack to the CSS Virginia. Interestingly, she would be the one to take those plans and give them in, and wouldn't give them to anyone else except to the Secretary of Navy, Gideon Wells. And we now have many of her letters as that she exchanged with him. And so I want to just conclude by inviting you to get a copy of the book because I have just touched on a little bit on the stories that I included in Virginia's Waterways. And I thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions. And I'm just going to leave on the screen for just a minute how you can find out more about the museum's activities, collections, and of course, what matters very much to them, which is educating people about Virginia's waterways. Thank you all so much, and I'm ready to take your questions.
I'm coming. I'm blown away. I have lived here for 30 plus years, and I have not heard one iota of what you have shared with us tonight, ever. It was just incredible. But we do have questions, so let's get to those. But uh, Bill is saying, could you please provide approximate numbers of Underground Railroad conductors and freedom seekers? He enjoyed the motivations for running away slide that you shared with us, but can you give approximate numbers?
You know, it's going to be almost impossible to give approximate numbers of people who escaped. Historians have pretty much estimated about 100,000 people. The more research I do, the more I'm convinced it's at least that number. Um, as for conductors, those numbers are not static either, because you had conductors who came and went. So it seems that the conductors may have lasted for 2 to 5 years at most, and then they had to escape. So John Hill was a conductor in Petersburg. You had William Bagnall in Norfolk. You also had a host of other people in the Norfolk Portsmouth area. There were at least, I think, about 7 that I have uncovered. And each community, you had 1 or 2, but they would last for a little bit, and then they had to flee, and then someone else would take their position as a conductor. So the numbers really, it depends on what period of time you're talking about, but it would be in the thousands if you look at the entire South, because the conductor is the one who would either actually carry you physically or guide you physically to the north, or in the case of the waterways, they would secure passage aboard a ship. And then of course the captain or the steward, whoever helped secure you, you know, once you got secured on that ship taking you to the north, they were not officially called a conductor. It would be those individuals that helped connect you with them. So I know that was a vague answer, and I apologize.
Skip Gray, it sounds like you all have talked about work at Caraways and tunnels. He's
Yes.
saying that as kids, we thought of the Underground Railroad as literally underground. Then we were told it was only a euphemism. Then it turns out that there were physical tunnels,
Yes.
as like at St. Mary's and most likely at Caraways. Can you
Yes.
elaborate on where the term the Underground Railroad originated?
Well, you know, whenever you are talking about an underground situation, you're talking about something that's secret. And it was a phrase that was coined after the birth of railroads in the early 1830s. And the whole idea was that you were creating this passageway, um, and that there would be regular transportation. But it was all secret, it was all hidden, it was all underground. Now, the means by which people were hidden or got to wherever they needed to go, in the case of Hampton Roads or Virginia, getting aboard ships, tunnels may have been used, cellars may have been used where people either um, would, in a hidden type of way, make their way to the ships. It varied, and that was really the purpose of a tunnel. Is it was an access point that was also hidden, that would help you to get from point A to where however you would depart, which was usually aboard a ship. Um, and in Hampton Roads, you know, it was pretty tough to have a tunnel because our water table is so high. And that's why the discovery of this brick line tunnel was so important in St. Mary's. And depending on where you are in Hampton Roads would depend upon whether you're at a higher ground enough that you may not have needed to have bricks. But if you were close to the waterway, um, and you had a tunnel, it would not survive if you did not have some sort of structure,
Right.
wood or brick, to support it.
Mhm. Marie asked, why did Robert Irving change his name to Sheridan Ford?
Because he was a fugitive. And there were so many accounts of slave catchers. You know, there were some people, they made their money being a slave catcher. Um, if you figure that you would get $100 from the state capturing a slave, and you might get 250 or $350 from the owner returning a slave. It was big business. And so many slave catchers would surround the port areas in northern territories. They would be along the borders between the United States and Canada. And you had communities that would really arm themselves to protect their people. In fact, Robert Hayden, who himself was a freedom seeker, he had a house on Beacon Hill in Boston. He would answer his door with a shotgun because he had so many slave catchers actually ring his doorbell to get him. And so the first thing they would see is a gun. De Morty, even though he was a free black, he was actually told by some of the white abolitionists, get a gun because they will come after you, because he had been, the reason he left Norfolk is that one of his letters to an abolitionist revealed that he was working with the Underground Railroad. And so people were trying to capture him to bring him back to the South and imprison him. So many, many free blacks armed themselves, enslaved people armed themselves. And the dumbest thing you could do was to keep your name that you had in slavery, because it was like, oh, an easy easy way to catch you. You know, you're right there with your name. So they would all take aliases. And of course, by the 1850s, all the abolitionists, once an enslaved person made it to freedom, would tell them, change your name.
That makes sense. Now, Matten asked, how did slave catchers identify specific slaves that they were looking for? How did they know who they were?
In some cases, the slave catchers were from those communities and they knew who the people were. Some of the descriptions, for example, most enslaved people would try to steal clothes so that they could change their clothing and try to hide themselves. But others didn't have an opportunity to do that. And so the descriptions would not only include their height, how much they may have weighed, any markings, their color. In fact, some of these runaway slave ads were incredibly creative, trying to describe someone's color,
Mhm.
creamy caramel, or you know,
Right.
charcoal, or uh, bright, nearly white, or I mean, they had all kinds of ways, and any scars,
Mhm.
any distinguishing features, whether you stuttered, whether you wore your hair long or short or whatever, they would describe all of those things.
Mhm.
And then they would say where they thought they were or where they were headed. And
Mhm.
so it gave the slave catchers a lot of clues, but ultimately the slave catchers almost didn't care. If you were a black person and they caught you, they would try to capture you and either sell you, if you were free black, sell you as a slave, claiming you were a slave, or they would hope that you were actually a runaway, and they would secure some kind of financial reward for that.
Gwendolyn asked, she's doing some research on and is interested in the New Bedford Norfolk connection. She's looking at activity in the 1820s and wonders if that might be a clue to Underground Railroad networks between the two through Quaker business connections. Have
Yes.
you seen
And
that?
I have, and that is a possibility. I would suggest start with Catherine Grover's book, Fugitives Gibraltar, and that's the story of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and really she just scratches the surface. It's a wonderful book, thick book, but she only scratches the surface of this incredible story of the Underground Railroad in that city.
Okay. Is there any evidence of the Rising Sun #2 Prince Hall Masons' involvement in the Underground Railroad?
Um, I have, um, what's interesting is De Morty was a Mason.
Okay.
And so, yes, it appears that the Masons had a network that linked them north and south.
Mhm.
And so, yes. But
Interesting.
will the Masons reveal their records is another issue. Not sure about
True.
that.
That's true. They're very, very close to the vest there. Yeah. Jasmine asked, are there more tunnels like the one found in Norfolk around Hampton Roads?
I have not heard of any other tunnels, but that is not to say there aren't. Um, I think that in some of the traditional Black community areas, we might be surprised. Um, but because there has been a lot of construction on the roads and
Hmm.
in and around those areas, they could have been destroyed years ago.
Hmm.
Uh, but it will be interesting as time goes on to do some archaeological surveys to see exactly what lies beneath.
Well, that was probably before they, now when you find something, APA wants you to contact them before you keep digging, right? So
Yes. Yes.
before those days, yeah.
They just destroyed it all.
That AP, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Um, Charlene asked, where are you presenting again later in the month? Because she could listen for several hours. I think we all want to know that.
There are some community groups that I'll be presenting to, but I don't think they're open to the general public.
Well, we're sure glad we got this opportunity. Paige Laws, I love Paige Laws. How are you? Another my friend from Norfolk State.
Yes, yes, she
This
left
one,
it. She's happy in retirement.
well, good for her. Um, we worked together a long time ago, but Cassandra, listeners who saw the film Harriet may recall the Philadelphia-based character played by Leslie Odom. Was that William Still?
Yes,
Okay,
and I was so excited to finally see him depicted in a film. Uh,
cool.
and they were pretty accurate with how they portrayed where he was and that whole interaction.
Carol, I'm not sure if you're asking if the museum will provide presentations on the Upper Chesapeake Bay or will Dr. Newby-Alexander. So I'm not sure how to direct that question. Dr. Alexander, do you have any comment from your end of things on talking about the Upper Chesapeake?
Well, one of the things that I'm still doing is doing a lot more research, pursuing some of these little clues as I go back through some of these accounts, and I'm finding so many different connections between people, and so my hope is to kind of look at these different regions and what was happening in these different regions. And I've collected quite a bit along the waterways and hope to do more. So it's probably going to be a couple of years before I'm ready to submit my manuscript.
Okay. Since you have so much free time, right? It sounds like. Carol asked, were free blacks who were involved in the underground targeted to be kidnapped by slave catchers?
Um, they were targeted because they were free blacks, not so much because they were actively involved with the Underground Railroad.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, free blacks throughout the country, but especially in places like Norfolk and Portsmouth,
Mhm.
and in northern areas were targeted.
Excuse me. Wendy asked, this may be a generalization, but the strength of the escape movement seems to be within the churches and received by other church members in the North, like the Quakers. Does this seem too simplistic? She says, I've always worried about the quote conversion of Africans to Christianity.
Um, it, it is very true that there was a strong connection between the churches and efforts to secret people out. What I have seen is that the African American churches, especially your Methodist and Baptist churches, were very heavily involved in helping to protect, resettle, provide resources, money, food, clothing, transportation to African Americans. And without those churches, they probably either would not have been protected, would have been captured, or may not have been able to resettle in the way that they did and become successful. And so these churches were important. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to focus our attention on the people who actually helped um, uh, directly. Uh, they really helped the freedom seekers to succeed. And
Mhm.
these were free blacks in northern communities who devoted so many resources to helping people. They would they became targets by welcoming them into their homes, giving them sanctuary, sometimes helping them settle within their communities. In fact, when I was on a personal side, when I was doing research looking at Chester County, I had no idea that one of my ancestors was involved with the Underground Railroad.
Oh,
And it's actually mentioned in William Still's book as helping an enslaved woman resettle within her community or within that community. And that area of Chester County, Hensonville, actually became the site for Lincoln University. And Hosanna Church, which is located on Lincoln University's campus, was a magnet for abolitionists. All the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, all of them came to that church and interacted with that community that helped um, freedom seekers to not only escape successfully, but then to be settled in and integrated into their communities.
well, Stephen is asking, was Harriet Tubman involved in the Norfolk Underground Railroad efforts ever?
No, all of her Underground Railroad activities were in Maryland. Um, but one of the things that's interesting about the film, I know there's a lot of controversy about one of the slave catchers being a black man and being pretty violent.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things that they showed was that she used different methods, including the waterways, to help people escape.
Mhm.
And because typically when people talk about Harriet Tubman, they depict her running on foot, um, and that was actually the most dangerous and most likely way you're going to get caught is to run on foot or even to be in a cart or wagon. Chances were much lower that you would be captured if you were aboard a ship.
Priscilla asked, excuse me, can you talk a bit about the recapture of Lewis Howard Latimer's father, George, who was defended in court by Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison in 1842.
Well, what was really interesting about that case, and the slaveholder was very, very upset um, about the outcome, is that so George Latimer, his father, well, his uncle was his original owner, and he sold him to a man who operated a steam factory, which is where Nauticus is located. That's about where Nauticus is located.
Mhm.
And when he escaped from him, his owner, some of these owners actually contracted with a constable to keep his eyes open. So he would go up to Boston. And George Latimer was working at a tavern, and that's when Capehart spotted him and brought him to the magistrate in Boston. And the abolitionists, the black abolitionists, were so angry that a person might actually be returned back to slavery, that they, and the constable up in Boston didn't seem to be sympathetic at all to the slave catchers. So they actually trumped up some charges against one of the slave catchers, not Capehart, because he had actually returned back to Norfolk and sent someone else to help. Um, oh, excuse me, the owner actually came up to Boston, not a slave catcher. So the owner came up, and that black abolitionists trumped up some charges against the owner, and the constable put the owner in jail. And they gathered together essentially and told the owner, you have to sell your slave to us, and this is the amount of money we're going to give you. And if you don't, you will be in prison. And so he agreed, signed it, and then came back to Norfolk and filed a lawsuit saying that he was swindled out of his slave. He was coerced to sign it, which he was. And all the abolitionists, of course, gathered around George Latimer to help and support him. He would eventually be defended by John Quincy Adams in court, and it was ruled that he was innocent. And so of course the owner just blasted that. There was all this controversy in Norfolk, but there was nothing they could do. And so George got into some trouble, eventually ended up in jail for a while, because it seems as if he was almost in a situation where he was so destitute, because it was very hard for free blacks to get jobs if they were skilled artisans. And so it seems that he stole bread to feed his family, and he was thrown in prison. He eventually got out, but his children, specifically Lewis Latimer, he was actually regarded as an orphan, and a family adopted and raised him. And eventually the two of them would reconcile later on in life. And George would become a very prominent businessman and mason in Lynn, Massachusetts.
Hmm. Jasmine asked, did abolitionists help enslaved people escape to other places beside northern US and Canada? For example, Africa. Well, we know Anthony Gardner went to Africa, specifically Liberia. He was born in Southampton County, and he was part of the American colonial, where they wanted to
Right, the
ship.
American Colonization Society.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
there was some sort of dovetailing with the American Colonization Society, the movement of both free and formerly enslaved people to Liberia, as well as a movement of missionaries, of Black missionaries. My great great grandfather and grandmother were abolitionists who were also missionaries and teachers, and they went to Liberia. He died over there, and his wife, my great great grandmother, returned along with my great grandfather, who was actually born in Liberia. And so you had this sort of migration back and forth by some, but others actually stayed in Liberia and became known as Afro-Liberians, where they, you know, settled, had children, had property, and grew and prospered. But the excuse me, the majority excuse me, the majority really chose not to leave because they believed that America was their home, and they did not want to go to another country.
Well, like one of our commenters said, we could listen for hours, but you have given us such a gift tonight, and we want to thank you so much. I want to have you back, and also I wanted to let our viewers know that when you were talking about the canals, next Friday at noon we will have a virtual program about George Washington and the Virginia canals that John Corstein, our Director Emeritus of the Monitor Center, will deliver. And so some of what you spoke of will be referenced there, but it's about all of the Virginia canals. And our next evening lecture, so you kicked our series off. Our next evening lecture is March 11th, and it will be War in the Tropics, and it will have two authors, Robert Macomber, who is the author of the Honor Series, and the infamous naval hero Peter Wake, and John Corstein. So we will have a historical fiction novelist and a nonfiction author to talk about war in Florida, Civil War in Florida and the Caribbean. So just so you know what's coming up, and we have a full month of programs that we are blessed to have you help kick it off this evening. And I know I speak for everyone that was here and everyone who will watch it later on YouTube. We thank you. We really do. And I think we'll sign off. And thank you so much again, Cassandra. It was fabulous.
Well, thank you. It was my honor. And as you all could tell, this is one of my favorite topics. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, and all, Howard and Jenna. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.